Laura's descent into temptation began on an unremarkable Thursday evening, the kind where the air is filled with idle chatter and half-empty glasses of wine. She had agreed to meet Chloe, her childhood friend, who had always been the vivacious one. Chloe wore her confidence like armor, flamboyant dresses, loud laughter, and a devil-may-care attitude that Laura found both intoxicating and slightly intimidating. Tonight, Chloe was on a mission. "Laura," she purred, leaning across the bar, her red lips curling into a mischievous grin, "you've been stuck in that beige, boring marriage for years. Don't you think you deserve something more?" Laura blinked, the words landing like a slap. "Beige? That's harsh." Chloe waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Darling, you know I'm right. Peter's nice. But don't you crave passion? Excitement? The thrill of being truly desired?" Her voice dipped lower, conspiratorial. "And safely, of course. No strings, no fallout." The idea seemed absurd. Laura sipped her wine, shaking her head, but Chloe was relentless. She painted a picture of a new life, one brimming with secret rendezvous, indulgent nights, and fiery trysts. "It's not cheating, not really," Chloe said with a shrug. "It's just a reset. Something just for you." Laura tried to resist, but Chloe's words lingered long after the evening ended. 2 weeks later, Laura found herself hesitating outside a sleek, dimly lit lounge. Chloe had set it all up. "They're perfect," Chloe had whispered. "You'll feel like the goddess you are. Just try it." Inside, Laura's nerves thrummed as she spotted the two men Chloe had described. Ethan was tall, with piercing eyes that seemed to strip her bare, while Marcus exuded a magnetic charm, his smile both inviting and dangerous. They greeted her like old friends, their casual familiarity disarming. The night began innocently enough, polite conversation, a bottle of expensive champagne. But as the alcohol flowed, so did the suggestive glances, the fleeting touches. Ethan leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he murmured compliments that made her blush. Marcus, meanwhile, kept his hand on the small of her back, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles. When Laura finally surrendered to the kiss Ethan initiated, it was like falling off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating. But Marcus wasn't one to be left behind. His hand slid to her waist, his lips claiming hers as Ethan watched, a wicked grin playing on his face. In the days that followed, Laura found herself swept up in a whirlwind of secret messages and clandestine meetings. The men, seemingly as competitive with each other as they were infatuated with her, orchestrated elaborate dates that left her breathless. They whispered fantasies into her ear, each more daring than the last. But the initial thrill soon gave way to complications. Ethan, who had appeared confident and composed, began exhibiting signs of possessiveness. One night, after a rendezvous with Marcus, Laura returned home to find a string of texts from Ethan, each one more desperate than the last. "You belong to me, Laura." Worse, Marcus seemed to revel in stirring the pot. "Ethan's not good enough for you," he would say, his tone dripping with disdain. "He's too predictable. You need someone who can really challenge you." The men's rivalry came to a head during an evening at an upscale hotel. What began as a playful dinner quickly spiraled into chaos when Ethan accused Marcus of monopolizing Laura's attention. The argument turned heated, their voices rising until other guests began to stare. Laura was mortified, caught between the two as they hurled accusations like petulant children. To make matters worse, Chloe's safe and discreet plan began unraveling. A waiter at the hotel recognized Laura and mentioned the encounter to a mutual acquaintance. Gossip spread like wildfire, and soon, Laura found herself fielding probing questions from friends and suspicious glances from Peter. The thrill of secrecy was replaced by the suffocating weight of guilt and fear. The final straw came when Laura received a package at her doorstep, a series of photos showing her and Ethan in compromising positions. The note attached read, "Thought you'd like a reminder of your escapades. See you soon, Marcus." Laura's world teetered on the edge of collapse. Ethan's obsession, Marcus's manipulations, and Chloe's careless encouragement had turned her life into a twisted game she could no longer control. Her phone buzzed incessantly, texts from Ethan begging for another chance, Marcus hinting at new fantasies, and Chloe urging her to relax and enjoy the ride. But the ride had become a nightmare, and Laura knew she had to find a way out before the facade of her life shattered completely. Laura arrived at the luxurious hotel with a mix of anticipation and nervous energy coursing through her. The lobby glimmered with the polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the faint scent of jasmine in the air. It was the kind of place she had only dreamed of visiting, and now, it was the stage for her most dangerous rendezvous yet. Ethan and Marcus were waiting for her upstairs in the suite Chloe had booked under a false name, a small detail that added to the thrill and fear coiling tightly in her chest. She glanced around cautiously, her heart hammering as she handed her coat to the concierge and made her way to the elevators. The soft hum of the doors closing behind her was almost deafening, her reflection in the polished interior revealing the telltale signs of her unease. She adjusted her lipstick, dabbed at the sheen of sweat forming on her forehead, and forced a confident smile. This was what Chloe had promised: freedom, excitement, a taste of the forbidden. She reminded herself of that as the elevator climbed, each number lighting up like a countdown to something irreversible. When the elevator doors slid open, Marcus was there, leaning casually against the wall, his crooked smile and sharp suit making him look every bit the devil Chloe had warned her about. "Laura," he said, his voice low and warm, "you're a vision." His eyes raked over her, and Laura felt a flush creep up her neck. Ethan was inside the suite, sitting on the edge of an opulent leather couch with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He stood as she entered, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. "Right on time," he murmured, his gaze smoldering. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn against the city lights, and the intimate atmosphere made Laura's pulse race. They moved with an ease that felt practiced, each man taking a side of her, their touches light but deliberate. Ethan's hand brushed her hair back from her face as Marcus leaned in to whisper something in her ear that made her stomach tighten. The tension in the room was electric, and Laura could feel herself surrendering to the allure of it all. But just as Marcus reached for her waist, the shrill ring of her phone shattered the moment like glass hitting concrete. Her heart leapt into her throat as she saw Peter's name flash across the screen. Her husband. The reminder of her other life hit her like a slap, and her hands trembled as she picked up the call. "Hey, Laura," Peter's voice sounded hoarse, strained. "I'm on my way home. Came down with something at work. Just couldn't stay any longer." Laura froze. Her brain scrambled to make sense of what he'd said. "You're coming home now?" she asked, her voice pitching higher than she intended. She turned away from the men, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Yeah," Peter replied, coughing into the receiver. "I think I've got the flu or something. I'll be home in about an hour." The room felt suddenly oppressive, the weight of the two men's presence suffocating her. She stammered. "Drive safe." She ended the call and turned to face Ethan and Marcus, who were watching her intently. "It's Peter," she said, her voice shaky. "He's coming home early. I have to go." Ethan's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "So what? You're just going to leave?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Marcus chuckled, stepping closer. "Come on, Laura. You're already here. Don't let a little phone call ruin the night." "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I have to get home before he does." Ethan stood abruptly, his glass clinking against the table as he set it down. "So this is it? You run back to your safe little life every time things get complicated?" His words were sharp, meant to cut, and Laura flinched. Marcus, always the smoother of the two, placed a hand on her arm. "Relax, sweetheart," he said softly, though there was an edge to his tone. "We'll make it quick. You won't be late." But the urgency in her chest was growing, and she pulled away from his touch. "No," she said more firmly this time. "I can't stay." Ethan scoffed, muttering something under his breath as he paced the room. "You're wasting everyone's time," he snapped, his frustration palpable. Laura gathered her things quickly, her movements clumsy and panicked. She felt the humiliation creeping in, the sting of their judgment pressing against her like a weight she couldn't shake. As she made her way to the door, Marcus called after her, his voice mocking. "Don't think we'll be waiting around next time," he said. "You don't get to play coy forever, Laura." The elevator ride down was excruciating, her reflection in the mirrored walls showing a woman she barely recognized. Her lipstick was smudged, her hair disheveled, and her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and shame. She couldn't believe she had come so close, how easily she had allowed herself to be swept up in Chloe's twisted fantasy. As she stepped into the cool night air, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Ethan. "You're going to regret walking out tonight." The words sent a chill down her spine, and she hurried to her car, her mind racing with a million possibilities. What if Peter had called earlier? What if she hadn't answered? The near miss was enough to make her stomach churn, but the fear of discovery wasn't enough to erase the humiliation she felt. Peter's car was already in the driveway when she arrived home. He was slumped on the couch, pale and sweating, with a blanket pulled over his legs. "Hey," he croaked as she entered. "Looked dressed up. What were you doing?" Laura froze, her mouth going dry. "Oh, just ran out to grab a few things," she lied, her voice faltering. Peter nodded weakly, his eyes already closing as he sank deeper into the couch cushions. The sight of him like this, vulnerable, trusting, made her chest ache with guilt. She knelt beside him, brushing a hand over his forehead. "You're burning up," she murmured. "I'll get you some water." As she moved through the house, the events of the evening replayed in her mind in excruciating detail. The way Ethan had looked at her, the heat of Marcus's hand on her arm, the cutting tone in their voices as she left. The humiliation of her aborted attempt at freedom hung over her like a storm cloud, threatening to drown her in its wake. Upstairs, she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her makeup was still smudged, her eyes hollow. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to erase the evidence of her guilt. But no matter how hard she scrubbed, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had left a mark, one that wouldn't easily fade. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to read people, especially Laura. After all, they'd been together for years. He knew her little habits, her rhythms, the way her laughter would lighten when she was nervous, and the way her voice softened when she was hiding something. That morning, as she hurried past him on her way out the door, he felt the first stirrings of unease. "Forgot your ring again?" he asked casually, his voice laced with just enough interest to mask the suspicion beneath. Laura froze mid-step, her hand instinctively brushing over her bare left finger. She turned with a forced smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I was just washing dishes earlier and must have left it by the sink. You know how I always forget to put it back on?" Ethan nodded, feigning nonchalance. But inside, his mind whirred. Laura never forgot her ring. She was meticulous about it, always sliding it back on with a small, unconscious flourish after cooking or cleaning. He said nothing more, watching as she slipped out the door with a hurried goodbye. Over the next few days, the details began to pile up. Subtle things, small changes that only someone as familiar with her as Ethan could notice. The faint traces of cologne, definitely not his, lingering on her clothes when she returned from her errands. The new lipstick in her makeup drawer, a shade bolder than she'd ever worn before. Her phone, once left casually on the counter, now constantly glued to her side, its screen tilted away whenever he walked past. The tipping point came one evening when Laura returned home late from one of her book club meetings. Ethan had been sitting in the living room, scrolling absent-mindedly through his emails when she walked in. The floral perfume she wore was mingled with a sharper, more masculine scent, one that immediately set his teeth on edge. "You smell nice," he remarked, his tone neutral as he set his phone aside. "What's that new fragrance?" Laura hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly as she hung up her coat. "Oh, must be from the store. I stopped by the fragrance aisle and tried a few samples." Ethan's lips curled into a faint smile, but his eyes betrayed nothing. "Really? It's quite strong for a sample." Laura laughed nervously, brushing past him. "You know those department stores, they drench everything in perfume." He let it go, but his suspicion was no longer a vague discomfort, it was a gnawing certainty. Something wasn't right. The next day, Ethan decided to take action. He left for work as usual but doubled back an hour later, feigning a forgotten briefcase. While Laura was out, he began setting up the devices he'd ordered online just days prior. Tiny, Inconspicuous microphones were discreetly placed in the living room, the kitchen, and even their bedroom. If there was something Laura wasn't telling him, he was determined to find out. 4 days he listened, combing through hours of mundane recordings. At first, there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator, the clinking of dishes, and Laura's occasional sighs as she went about her day. But then late one evening he heard it. A faint, muffled voice, unfamiliar, male. "Can't stop thinking about you, Laura," the voice said, low and intimate. Ethan's stomach churned as he leaned closer to the recording. Laura's response was softer, harder to discern, but the warmth in her voice was unmistakable. His hands clenched into fists as he listened to the exchange, every word slicing through him like a blade. He didn't confront her. Not yet. Ethan knew better than to play his hand too soon. Instead, he doubled down, installing a small camera in the study, one of the few places Laura seemed to spend an unusual amount of time lately. He told himself he wasn't being paranoid, that he was simply protecting his marriage, his life. The humiliation was a slow burn, a bitter taste in his mouth every time he smiled at her, pretended everything was fine. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Laura slept beside him, her breathing soft and steady. The woman he'd built a life with, shared dreams with, was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't even know who she was anymore. One evening, while Laura was out, Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat at the dining table with his laptop. He replayed the recordings, each one unraveling more of the facade she had so carefully maintained. The conversations were subtle, filled with innuendos and coded language that made his blood boil. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the effort she was putting into deceiving him, the thoughtfulness she once reserved for him now directed elsewhere. When Laura came home that night, Ethan greeted her with his usual smile, though it felt like a mask. She kissed him on the cheek, her lips brushing lightly against his skin, and he fought the urge to recoil. Instead, he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "How was your night?" he asked, his tone light, casual. "Fine," she replied, her eyes flickering briefly to her phone before she set it face down on the counter. Ethan watched her carefully, every movement, every word a potential clue. "You seem tired," he said. "Anything on your mind?" She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "Just a long day. I think I'll head to bed early." As she disappeared up the stairs, Ethan remained at the table, staring at the spot where her phone had been. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, suffocating. He didn't want to believe it, didn't want to face the reality of what was happening. But the evidence was there, undeniable. The following morning, Ethan decided to test her. As Laura prepared to leave for the day, he reached for her hand, lifting it gently. "You forgot your ring again," he said, his voice laced with mock concern. Laura froze, her eyes darting to her bare finger. "Oh, I must have left it upstairs." Ethan smiled, his expression calm, almost amused. "Funny, you've been forgetting it a lot lately. Everything okay?" Her cheeks flushed and she forced a laugh. "Of course. Just scatterbrained, I guess." He let her go without pressing further, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and he could see it in her eyes. Laura was unraveling, and Ethan was determined to pull every loose thread until the whole thing came apart. That night, as Laura slept, Ethan sat alone in the darkened study, staring at the camera feed on his laptop. It felt like an invasion, a betrayal of his own, but he couldn't stop. He needed answers, needed to understand why the woman he loved was slipping away. And as he watched her, listened to the whispers of her secret life, Ethan felt a cold, unfamiliar rage settle over him, a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface, ready to erupt. Chloe's voice was sharp, insistent, as she spoke over the phone. "Laura, you're overthinking this again. You keep getting cold feet, and for what? You deserve this. You deserve to feel alive, to feel wanted. Just go, let yourself have this one thing." Laura gripped the phone tighter, her teeth worrying at her bottom lip. Chloe's words echoed in her mind like a mantra, feeding the growing storm of desire, guilt, and fear that had taken root inside her. After weeks of half-hearted attempts and aborted meetings, the pressure had finally reached its boiling point. Ethan's sharp eyes, his probing questions, his calm smiles that felt increasingly like traps, None of it had been enough to deter her. If anything, it pushed her closer to the edge. She felt suffocated, cornered. And now Chloe's relentless encouragement tipped her over. That night, Laura stood in front of the mirror, her reflection a stranger. Her dress clung a little too tightly, her lipstick a little too red. She adjusted the neckline nervously, her fingers trembling as she imagined what lay ahead. She wasn't the type to do this, was she? That question lingered as she grabbed her keys and stepped into the night. The hotel was the same as before, every detail from the grand chandelier to the soft hum of the elevator pressing down on her chest like a weight. Marcus was waiting in the suite, his shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal a hint of his chest. He greeted her with a smirk that made her pulse race and her stomach churn. Ethan arrived minutes later, his gaze as intense as ever, the whiskey glass already in his hand. Third time's the charm, Marcus teased as he poured her a glass of wine. We were starting to think you'd never make up your mind. Laura tried to laugh, but it came out strained, the sound unnatural even to her own ears. Ethan studied her closely, his eyes raking over her like he was searching for something. Relax, he murmured, his voice low. You're here now. Just let go. Letting go was easier than she expected. The wine dulled the sharp edges of her guilt, and the men's practiced ease guided her through every moment. Ethan's hands were firm but gentle as he pulled her closer, his breath warm against her neck. Marcus, always the bolder of the two, moved behind her, his hands skimming over her waist. Their movements were seamless, synchronized, like they'd done this 100 times before. And maybe they had. For a while, Laura forgot everything. She forgot Peter's face, the ring she'd left on the nightstand, the suspicion that had been lurking in the corners of her mind. She let herself get swept up in the moment, the thrill of being wanted by not one but two men overwhelming every rational thought. The night blurred into a haze of whispers, laughter, and tangled sheets. By the time she left the hotel in the early hours of the morning, she felt drained, her body heavy with exhaustion and her mind swimming with conflicting emotions. The rush of exhilaration had already begun to fade, replaced by the cold, creeping weight of reality. She arrived home to find the house dark and silent, Peter's car still in the driveway. She slipped inside quietly, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she made her way upstairs. As she reached the bedroom, she froze. Peter was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully awake, his phone in his hand. The lamp on his nightstand cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. "Laura," he said calmly, his voice betraying none of the emotion she expected. "You're home late?" Her breath hitched, her pulse quickening. She began, but the words caught in her throat. Peter stood, his movements slow and deliberate as he placed the phone on the nightstand. "No excuses," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I already know." The room tilted beneath her feet. What are you talking about?" Peter's lips twisted into a humorless smile. "Do you think I haven't noticed? The missing ring, the new perfume, the late nights. And let's not forget the hotel charges on the credit card. You didn't even bother hiding those." Her stomach dropped. "Peter, I've been watching, Laura," he interrupted, his voice growing colder. "I've known for weeks. I've heard the recordings. I've seen the messages. Do you have any idea how humiliating this has been for me? Watching you sneak around like I'm some blind idiot." The words hit her like a physical blow, each one cutting deeper than the last. Laura stumbled back, her hands trembling as she tried to find the right thing to say, something to undo the damage. "I didn't mean for—" "Save it," Peter snapped. "I don't want your excuses. I want to know why. Why wasn't I enough for you?" Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to form a coherent response. Chloe said, "I just needed something for myself. It wasn't supposed to mean anything." Peter laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and cutting. "Nothing? You threw away our marriage for nothing?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Laura could feel the weight of Peter's gaze, the disappointment and anger radiating off him in waves. She wanted to disappear, to erase the last few hours, the last few weeks. But it was too late. Everything was laid bare. "You thought you were so clever," Peter continued, his tone mocking. "But the truth is, you're not even good at this. I've known every step of the way. I've known about Ethan and Marcus. Hell, I've probably heard more of your conversations with them than you have." Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. The humiliation was unbearable, a burning shame that left her feeling exposed and raw. What are you going to do?" Peter didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, watching her with a mixture of disgust and pity. Finally he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I haven't decided yet. But don't think for a second that you're walking away from this unscathed." He turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Laura sat there in the silence, the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. For the first time, she truly understood the magnitude of what she'd done. And she knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan's rage had been terrifying. Laura had seen him angry before, brief flashes of frustration during arguments about finances or their children, but this was different. This was cold, controlled fury, the kind that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. The morning after he revealed everything, she woke to find him standing by the window, his back to her, silhouetted against the early light. "You've humiliated me," he said without turning. His voice was eerily calm, but there was an undercurrent of menace that made her stomach churn. "You've humiliated yourself. And you've destroyed everything we built together." Laura tried to speak, but her throat felt like it had closed. She hadn't slept, the events of the previous night replaying in her mind like a nightmare. "Ethan, I made a mistake." He turned then, his eyes like steel. "A mistake? You call that a mistake? Sneaking around with two men, lying to my face every day for weeks? This isn't a mistake, Laura. This is a choice." Repeated choices. The weight of his words crushed her. She had no defense, no excuse that would make sense. She had done this. She had ruined everything. But the danger in his voice was escalating, and when he took a step toward her, she instinctively flinched. Ethan noticed. He stopped mid-step, his jaw tightening. "So now you're scared of me?" "You should be." The day passed in unbearable silence, Ethan stalking through the house like a caged animal while Laura hovered, unsure whether to flee or try to mend the irreparable damage. But when evening fell, his anger reached a boiling point. He cornered her in the kitchen, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just walk away from this? After everything you've done? There's no running from this, Laura. No running from me." The words chilled her to the bone. She realized then that Ethan wasn't just angry, he was unhinged. And whatever love she had once seen in his eyes was gone, replaced by something darker, something that made her feel like prey. That night she called Chloe. "Laura, you have to leave," Chloe said, her voice urgent. "Pack a bag and get out of there. Come to my place. We'll figure something out." Laura didn't hesitate. While Ethan was upstairs, she grabbed a duffel bag and stuffed it with clothes, her wallet, and the little cash she had stashed away. She left her phone on the kitchen counter, knowing Ethan could use it to track her, and slipped out the back door into the night. Chloe was waiting at her apartment, a glass of wine in one hand and a cigarette in the other. "You did the right thing," she said, pulling Laura into a hug. "We'll get you somewhere safe." But safe was a fleeting concept. The following days were a blur of frantic planning, whispered conversations, and paranoia. Ethan began calling Chloe relentlessly, his voice growing more threatening with each voicemail. "I know she's with you," he snarled in one. "You're only making this worse for her." By the end of the week, Chloe had secured fake identification for Laura and arranged for her to leave town. "You can't stay here," she said firmly. "He'll find you. And if he does..." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Laura left without saying goodbye. The first city was small, anonymous, and unbearably lonely. She took a job under the table, waitressing at a dingy diner and renting a cramped room in a boarding house. She avoided eye contact with strangers, flinched whenever someone called her name, even though it wasn't really her name anymore. But Ethan's reach seemed endless. One night, a coworker mentioned a man who had come into the diner, asking questions about a woman matching Laura's description. The man left after being told no one knew her, but the fear that he might return was enough to send Laura packing again. And so it began. Every few months, She moved to a new town, a new state, each time shedding another layer of her identity. She changed her hair, her wardrobe, her mannerisms. She stopped making friends, stopped trusting anyone. Chloe was her only connection to the life she'd left behind, and even their contact was sparse and cautious. Years passed in a haze of fear and isolation. Laura learned to live out of a single suitcase, to carry only what she could abandon at a moment's notice. She rented apartments without leases, worked jobs that paid cash, and avoided anything that might leave a paper trail. Her life became a series of exits, back doors, late-night bus stations, nameless motels. But the fear never left. Every time she saw a man who resembled Ethan, her heart would seize in her chest. Every knock at the door felt like a death knell. She dreamed of him often, his voice cold and accusing, his hands reaching for her in the dark. The years took their toll. By the time a decade had passed, Laura barely recognized herself. The vibrant, confident woman who had once been swept up in Chloe's promises of excitement was gone, replaced by someone gaunt, wary, and perpetually on edge. She had no home, no family, no sense of self. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of her own life. One rainy evening, as she sat in a dim motel room in yet another unfamiliar town, Laura stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her face was lined with worry, her eyes hollow. The person she had become was a stranger, and for the first time, she wondered if the punishment she had been running from was worse than the life she was now enduring. The knock at the door startled her. Her breath hitched, and her pulse raced as she crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The figure outside was indistinct, cloaked in shadows. But as they knocked again, more insistently, Laura's stomach twisted. "Laura," the voice called, deep and familiar. "You can't hide forever." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Ethan was still out there, and no matter how far she ran, he would always be one step behind.